You soft-pampered aliens could never survive a week on Earth, yet you dare call my planet a Deathworld? The human ambassador's deep voice boomed through the grand Galactic Council chamber, silencing the murmuring crowd and shocking the smug Andorian High Counselor. Ambassador Mitchell had traveled for months to reach the gleaming halls of the Council, determined to defend humanity's place among the stars. But High Counselor Pryler's condescending speech, painting Earth as a savage backwater unfit for galactic society, threatened to undo it all. Matthew strode to the podium, the rhythmic clack of his boots on marble the only sound as thousands of eyes from a rainbow of alien races tracked his every move. He met Pryler's imperious glare. "Your Excellency, I will not stand for these baseless accusations. Judge us by our actions, not your prejudiced assumptions." Pryler sneered. "Your actions speak for themselves. Humans are impulsive, violent, an infection that will destabilize the peace we've maintained for eons. This council has no choice but to quarantine your kind on that death world you call home." Angry shouts erupted from the human delegation, but Matthew raised a hand, silencing them. He had to choose his next words carefully. Failure here meant not just shame, but the end of humanity's galactic ambitions. One wrong move, and Earth would be cut off, alone against the dangers of an uncaring universe. Matthew met Pryler's eyes, unflinching. "If you think mere insults will convince us to abandon our rightful place in this council, you have badly misjudged humanity. We do not beg, we do not yield. Earth has forged us in the crucible of adversity, and the strength we have gained will not be dismissed. By the end of this session, you will understand the depths of your error in challenging us." He placed his hands on the podium, the ancient wood cool against his skin. The future of his species hung in the balance. It was time to show these aliens the true mettle of humanity. Matthew inhaled deeply, centering himself before stepping forward to face the assembled council. He acknowledged the challenges humanity had faced on Earth, the natural disasters, the harsh conditions, the constant struggle for survival. But, he argued, it was precisely these trials that had shaped humans into the resilient, ingenious species they were today. As he spoke, describing how humans had not just endured, but flourished in the face of unrelenting adversity, the chamber grew quiet. The delegates leaned forward in their seats, some with expressions of grudging respect, others with thinly veiled unease. Emboldened, Matthew pressed on. He suggested that perhaps the Council's insistence on isolating humanity stemmed not from concern, but from fear. Fear of what humans could achieve, fear that they might disrupt the careful balance of power the Council had maintained for so long. High Counselor Pryler shot to his feet, his face a mask of outrage. He demanded that Matthew retract his accusation immediately, but the human ambassador stood firm, meeting Pryler's furious gaze with calm resolve. "I will not," Matthew said evenly. "The truth is often uncomfortable, but it must be spoken." Pryler's eyes bulged, his skin darkening to a deep purple. "The truth?" he spat. "You want the truth about your species? The truth is that you are a plague, a viru—" Suddenly the Andorian's words cut off in a strangled gasp. His hands flew to his throat, clawing at it as if he couldn't breathe. The chamber erupted into panicked shouts as Pryler staggered and collapsed, his aides rushing to his side. A medical team pushed through the crowd, converging on the fallen High Counselor. They worked frantically, but after a few tense moments, they stepped back, shaking their heads grimly. Pryler, the most powerful figure in the Andorian Empire, was dead. In the stunned silence that followed, a sibilant voice rose above the rest. "The human!" hissed the Krill delegate, stabbing a clawed finger at Matthew. "He did this! Assassin!" The cry was taken up by others, echoing off the chamber walls. "Murderer! Seize him!" The crowd surged forward, a sea of hostile faces and grasping hands. Matthew backed away, hands raised. "No!" he shouted desperately. "I had nothing to do with this." But his protests were lost in the tumult. The delegates closed in, ready to tear him apart. Just as it seemed all was lost, a collective gasp rippled through the room. Everyone froze, turning as one to stare at the massive view screen on the far wall. An emergency broadcast had interrupted the proceedings, the image of an ashen-faced Andorian newscaster filling the screen. "Tragedy strikes at the heart of the Empire," the newscaster intoned, his voice shaking. "The entire Andorian imperial family has been found dead within the palace. Cause of death is unknown at this time. The Empire is in crisis. Martial law has been declared effective immediately." As the broadcast continued, Matthew could only watch in numb disbelief, his mind reeling. In the space of a few minutes, the political landscape of the galaxy had shifted seismically. The implications were staggering, the repercussions unimaginable. And somehow he knew with a bone-deep certainty humanity had just been thrust into the center of it all. The chamber was in an uproar, delegates shouting over each other, demanding answers, hurling accusations. In the midst of the chaos, Matthew stood very still, a lone island of humanity in an alien sea. He could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him, suspicious, fearful, hostile. They blamed him for Pryla's death. They thought humanity was responsible for this unfolding catastrophe. And now, with the Andorian Empire teetering on the brink of collapse, old galactic alliances would shift and crumble. The Council would be looking for someone to hold accountable. They would need a scapegoat. Matthew's throat was dry, his heart pounding a drumbeat in his ears. He knew with a terrible clarity that the survival of his entire species might depend on what he did next. But what could one man, one human, do in the face of such cataclysmic events? As if in answer, a heavy hand fell on Matthew's shoulder. He turned to see. Slipping out unnoticed in the chaos, Matthew hurried down the empty hallways of the Galactic Council headquarters. His footsteps echoed too loudly in the eerie stillness. The normal bustle of the building had vanished, leaving only a creeping sense of wrongness. Just as he entered the shuttle bay, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Matthew spun around, heart pounding, to find Zaxol, the Krill delegate, standing before him. The old alien's face was etched with fear, his usual sternness replaced by a haunted look. "Come with me," Zaxol whispered urgently, pulling Matthew into a cramped maintenance closet before he could protest. In the dim light, the Krill leaned in close, his voice low and grave. "The virus is spreading through the Andorian leadership," he said, "killing them off one by one, and I don't think it's natural. I believe it was engineered by someone within the Council itself." Matthew stared at him, shock and disbelief warring on his face. "What? How do you know this?" Zaxol pressed a small data chip into the human's hand. "The evidence is all here, but you must go now, get as far away as you can. I'll try to buy you some time, but I don't know how long I can hold them off." "But—" Matthew started to protest, his mind reeling. Zaxol cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "No. If what I suspect is true, nowhere in Council space will be safe for you. Go, please." With a last nod of thanks, Matthew slipped out of the closet and made his way to his shuttle, his heart racing. As he began the takeoff sequence, an incoming message blinked on his encrypted channel. It was from the human ambassador on Earth. Matthew opened the recording with a growing sense of dread. The ambassador's face was pale, her eyes haunted. "Matthew, a virus, it's spreading across Earth like wildfire, millions dead already. The symptoms, they match what's happening to the Andorians." Her voice broke. "It's the same thing. It has to be. Earth is under quarantine now. All of you out there, stay away, stay safe." The recording ended. Matthew sat frozen, his blood turning to ice in his veins. A virus that could infect both humans and Andorians. If it spread further, it could potentially ravage every species in the galaxy. He engaged the shuttle's engines with shaking hands, plotting a course for the lawless outer rim. He needed answers, needed a way to stop this before it consumed everything. But out here, at the edge of known space, who could he trust? What allies could he find in a galaxy that seemed to be unraveling before his eyes? As the shuttle leapt into the dark expanse of space, Matthew couldn't shake the bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning, that something far more terrifying than he could even imagine was unfolding, and he was now at the very heart of it. The shadows seemed to press in around him, cold and hungry, as he raced towards an uncertain future, and The vast emptiness of space stretched out before Matthew's shuttle as he navigated through the lawless expanse of the outer rim. The uncharted regions out here were a haven for the desperate and the depraved, smugglers, pirates, and mercenaries all plying their trade far from the watchful eyes of the Galactic Council. Suddenly his comm unit crackled to life, an incoming hail from an unmarked ship. Matthew's hand hovered over the controls, his suspicion warring with his curiosity. Out here, an unexpected message could be a trap or an opportunity. Cautiously, he opened the channel. The face that flickered to life on his view screen was one he recognized instantly. Jax, a notorious mercenary, with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and a complete lack of scruples. Matthew had tangled with him once before, years ago. It hadn't ended well. "Ambassador," Jax said, his voice a low rasp, "I've been looking for you." Matthew leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "I'm a little busy at the moment, Jax. I don't have time for games." "This isn't a game." Jax's scarred face was grim. "I've been hired to track down the origin of that virus that's tearing through the Andorians, and I need your help." Matthew frowned. "Why would I help you?" "Because my client has a lead." Jax leaned forward, his eyes intense. "A secret research facility, hidden deep in the nebula X7. They think it's ground zero for this whole mess." The nebula X7. Matthew had heard stories about that place, a swirling mass of gas and dust on the fringes of known space, a perfect hiding spot for those who didn't want to be found. If there were answers to be had about the virus, that would be the place to look. He hesitated, torn. Trusting Jax was a risk, but if there was even a chance... "All right," he said at last. "I'm in. Send me the coordinates." As the two ships raced towards the distant nebula, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crept up his spine. They were heading into the unknown, chasing a horror that had already claimed countless lives. There was no telling what they might find. The swirling clouds of the nebula loomed before them, a churning mass of color and shadow. As they drew closer, a sudden ping from the sensors made Matthew sit up straight in his chair. A distress signal, weak and garbled, emanating from somewhere within the nebula's depths. He boosted the signal, straining to make out the words through the static. Outbreak, containment breach, SOS. A chill ran through him. He met Jax's eyes on the view screen, seeing his own apprehension mirrored there. Without a word, they angled their ships towards the source of the signal and plunged into the nebula. The wreckage of the research facility drifted before them, a twisted mass of metal and composites, silhouetted against the swirling gases. Scorch marks and blast holes pockmarked its surface, testament to some violent struggle. An eerie stillness hung over the scene, broken only by the hiss of their ship's engines. They docked and donned their environmental suits, the seals hissing closed with a sound that seemed far too loud in the oppressive silence. The airlock cycled open, and they stepped out into the ruined station. Horror greeted them. Bodies littered the corridors, sprawled in contorted heaps where they had fallen. Scientists, security personnel, their faces frozen in masks of agony. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid tang of burnt plastic. Matthew swallowed hard against the bile that rose in his throat. Beside him, Jax's face was pale behind his visor. They moved forward cautiously, the only sound the rasp of their breathing in the suit's recycled air. A sudden clatter made them spin around, weapons drawn. A figure stumbled out of the shadows, his suit torn, his face ashen. He stared at them with wild, haunted eyes. You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "It's not safe." Matthew lowered his gun slightly. "We're here about the virus. What happened here?" The man shuddered. "I'm Krell. I was the lead scientist. We were trying to find a cure, but something went wrong. It mutated, became more deadly. When the outbreak started, the station AI sealed everything." He pressed a shaking hand to his faceplate. "I managed to send a distress call before the AI cut off communications. Please, you have to destroy this place. Destroy the research." Krell fumbled at a pouch on his suit, pulling out a small data drive. He pressed it into Matthew's hand, his grip fevered, desperate. "Take this, my research. Maybe you can use it. Maybe you can stop this." Matthew opened his mouth to reply, but the words died in his throat. Krell's eyes had gone wide with sudden stark terror, fixed on something over Matthew's shoulder. He spun, raising his weapon, and felt his blood turn to ice. Shambling figures were emerging from the shadows, lurching towards them with jerky, unnatural movements. The scientists, the security officers, but changed, their bodies warped and twisted, their faces distorted in rictuses of pain and hunger. Krell let out a choked scream. "Run!" he cried. "Run before—" The creatures surged forward, overwhelming him in a tide of grasping hands and snapping jaws. His screams echoed through the ruined halls. Matthew and Jax ran, blasting a path through the horde, the sizzle of their weapons' fire mingling with the snarls of the infected. They burst out onto the docking platform, a writhing mass of mutated flesh pouring out behind them. They leaped into their ships, fingers flying over the controls. The engines roared to life, thrusters flaring as they blasted away from the station, the monstrous horde grasping futilely after them. As the ruins of the facility receded into the swirling mists of the nebula, Matthew clutched the data drive in a white-knuckled grip, his heart pounding. The horror of what they had seen burned behind his eyes. Krell's dying words echoed in his mind. "Maybe you can stop this." He didn't know if it was possible, didn't know if there was any hope left, but as he exchanged a grim look with Jax across the void of space, he knew one thing for certain. They had to try. As Matthew's shuttle hurtled through the void, he and Jax hunched over the flickering screens, their eyes raw and bloodshot as they sifted through the tangled web of Krell's research. Line after line of code and formula flashed by, a dizzying array of symbols and numbers that seemed to mock their desperate search for answers. Matthew's heart felt like a lead weight in his chest as the horrifying truth began to take shape before his eyes. This virus wasn't just another experiment gone wrong. It was an engineered weapon, a twisted masterpiece of destruction designed with a single terrifying purpose: to unmake all life in the galaxy. His hands shook as he scrolled through the files, each new revelation hitting him like a physical blow. The shadowy figures behind this plot had thought of everything, tailoring the virus to exploit the genetic weaknesses of every known species, building in fail-safes and contingencies to ensure its spread. It was a doomsday weapon of unimaginable scale, and it was already unleashed. Jax's face was ashen as he looked up from his own screen. "There's no cure," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "This thing, it's too perfect, too adaptable. It won't stop until—" He trailed off, but Matthew could see the unspoken truth in his eyes. Until everything was gone. Until the galaxy was a tomb, echoing with the silence of 1,000,000,000,000 extinguished lives. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the shuttle's engines, an incongruously peaceful backdrop to the horror that gripped them. Then, slowly, Matthew sat back in his chair, a grim resolve settling over him. "We have to warn them," he said, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "Everyone, anyone who's left, we have to give them a chance." Jax nodded, his jaw tight. "A beacon. We'll put together all the data, everything we've found, and launch it into the deepest reaches. Maybe someday someone will find it. Learn from our mistakes." It was a desperate plan, a shot in the dark against an implacable foe. But it was all they had, all that was left to them in the face of the coming darkness. But even as they began to lay out the details, a new thought crept into Matthew's mind, insidious and cold. Launching the beacon wasn't enough. They had to ensure that the virus was stopped here, in this lonely corner of the void. They had to make sure it could spread no further. He met Jax's gaze, seeing the same realization dawn in the other man's eyes. Slowly Jax nodded, a grim acceptance settling over his features. "The station," he said quietly. "We overload the reactors, blow it all to hell. Take the whole damn nebula with it if we have to." Matthew swallowed hard, the enormity of what they were proposing settling into his bones like a chill. It was a suicide mission, a last stand against an enemy that knew nothing of mercy or relent. But what choice did they have? What price was too high to pay when the alternative was the end of everything? With heavy hearts and trembling hands, they laid in a course back towards the ravaged research station, the weight of their decision hanging over them like a shroud. They worked in grim silence, rigging the beacon, prepping the overload sequence. Each movement felt weighted, imbued with a terrible finality. As they approached the twisted husk of the station, a new horror greeted them. The mutant horde had grown, a seething mass of writhing, misshapen forms that swarmed over the ruined halls like a living tide. Thousand upon thousand of them, a grotesque parody of the life they had once known. Matthew felt a cold sweat break out across his skin as he realized the enormity of the task before them. They would have to fight their way through that nightmare throng, carving a path to the reactor core. And then... He shook his head, forcing the thought away. One thing at a time, survive, move forward, don't look back. With grim determination, they armed themselves, checking and double-checking their weapons. The shuttle shuddered as they docked, the airlock hissing open to reveal a scene straight out of a fevered nightmare. The creatures surged towards them, a howling, snarling mass of teeth and claws and twisted, grasping limbs. Matthew and Jax met them with a hail of weapons fire, the stench of burnt flesh and ozone filling the air as they pushed forward, step by blood-soaked step. Every second was a battle. Every inch of ground gained a small eternity of horror and struggle. Matthew lost himself in the rhythm of it, his world narrowing to the kick of his gun, the crunch of bone under his boots, the endless, seething tide of mutated flesh. Time lost all meaning in that crimson haze, minutes blurring into hours, hours into a nightmarish eternity. But finally, impossibly, they stood before the reactor core, the pulsing heart of the station. With shaking hands, they input the overload sequence, the countdown flickering to life on the screens above. They had minutes, precious little time to fight their way back to the shuttle and escape the coming inferno. But as they turned to make their desperate retreat, a new wave of horror broke over them. The creatures had redoubled, a solid wall of writhing, grasping death that filled the hallway before them. Matthew felt a sickening lurch of despair in his gut. They weren't going to make it. Not both of them, not through that. He turned to Jax, opening his mouth to, "What? Apologize? Say goodbye?" He didn't know. But the words died in his throat as he saw the look in his friend's eyes. A grim resignation, a quiet acceptance of what had to be done. "Go," Jax said, his voice steady even as his hands tightened on his weapon. "I'll hold them off, buy you some time." Matthew shook his head, a protest rising to his lips, but Jax cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Damn it, Matt, one of us has to make it out of here. One of us has to launch that beacon. It has to be you. Now go, before—" His words were lost in a fresh surge of howls as the horde pressed forward, a seething tide of claws and teeth and twisted, grasping limbs. With a last anguished look at his friend, Matthew turned and ran, tears blurring his vision as he fought his way through the press of bodies. Behind him, he heard the roar of Jax's weapon, a defiant bellow of rage and pain that seemed to shake the very walls. And then silence, a terrible ringing silence that seemed to swallow all the world. Somehow, through the haze of grief and horror, Matthew made it back to the shuttle. His hands shook on the controls as he initiated the launch sequence, the hiss of hydraulics and the roar of engines drowning out the pounding of his own heart. The shuttle lurched and shuddered as it tore free from the station, fighting against the pull of the nebula's gravity well. On the screens, Matthew watched as the first explosions began to blossom across the station's hull, a chain reaction of destruction that spread like wildfire through its twisted corridors. He pushed the engines to their limits, feeling the deck plates rattle beneath his feet as he raced the expanding fireball, the shuttle straining to break free of the nebula's grasp. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he wouldn't make it, that the fires would catch him, consume him, erase all trace of his existence from the universe. But then, with a final shuddering roar, the shuttle broke free. the shockwave of the station's death throes slamming into the hull like a hammer blow. And then, silence. The deep, endless silence of the void, broken only by the ragged sound of Matthew's own breathing. He slumped back in his chair, his whole body shaking with exhaustion and grief. On the screens the nebula burned, a funeral pyre of cosmic proportions, the grave of 1 trillion hopes and dreams. He had made it. He was alive. But at what cost? Jax was gone, sacrificed to the horror they had unleashed, and out there, in the vast reaches of the galaxy, the virus still spread, an implacable tide of destruction that threatened to swallow all in its path. With numb mechanical movements, Matthew set a course for the outer reaches, his mind reeling with the enormity of what he had to do. He had to find a way to launch the beacon, to warn the galaxy of the coming doom. It was all he had left, the only flicker of purpose in the yawning void that threatened to swallow him whole. As the shuttle hurtled through the endless night, a chime from the comms panel startled him out of his dark reverie. With a feeling of dread, he opened the channel, steeling himself for whatever fresh horror awaited. The face that flickered to life on the screen was haggard, haunted, the eyes hollow with a grief beyond words. It was the human ambassador on Earth, her voice cracking with emotion as she delivered the news that shattered the last of Matthew's hopes. Earth was lost. The virus had spread like wildfire, consuming all in its path. In a desperate, last-ditch effort to contain the outbreak, the planet's leaders had enacted a scorched Earth protocol, bombarding their own cities, reducing them to ash and ruin. Billions dead, a world in flames, and all for naught. The virus couldn't be stopped, couldn't be contained. It would spread inexorably until there was nothing left to infect, nothing left to kill. As the transmission ended, Matthew felt a cold, numb acceptance settle over him. This was the end then, the end of everything. The galaxy would burn, consumed by the folly and hubris of those who had sought to play God. There would be no grand alliance, no last-minute salvation. Only the grim reality of a universe unraveling, the cruel echo of extinction spreading across the stars. With a heavy heart, Matthew engaged the warp drive, the shuttle leaping forward into the void. He had a mission, a purpose, even if it was a futile one. He would launch the beacon, send out the warning. And then he would face the end, alone in the endless night, the weight of 1 trillion souls heavy on his shoulders. It was all he could do, all any of them could do in the face of the coming darkness. As the stars blurred and streaked around him, Matthew closed his eyes, a single silent tear tracing its way down his cheek. In the end, there was only the void, and the slim, desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, a flicker of life might endure to carry the memory of all that had been lost. The shuttle hurtled on, a tiny mote of light in the vast, uncaring darkness, bearing its lonely cargo into the unknown reaches of space. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.